Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Andrew Maxey. Andrew is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Tuscaloosa City Schools in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Roll Tide, of course.
Roll
Andrew
Tide.
definitely has a few passions in education, effective grading practices, middle-level practices informed by the deep knowledge of young adolescents, and, of course, educational leadership. He is especially vocal about the complexity of teaching and the ongoing deprofessionalization of teaching. And to that end, Andrew is the author of the recently released Elephant in the Classroom, Tracing the Complexity of Teaching by Exploring 13 Competencies and Practices. And that is going to be our focus for today's conversation. So, Andrew, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. It's an honor.
It's great to see you, Andrew. It's great to reconnect with you. We haven't touched base in a while. Happy New Year, of course. And congratulations on the book. I want to spend our time today kind of highlighting for listeners some of the big ideas that you write about. And I think this will give listeners yet another reason why they should seek out the book and purchase it and give it a read, because I think it has it's very thorough and yet accessible in its approach. So let's jump right in. I know that it's your contention in the introduction of the book. You write, quote, "The problem is not that we don't know enough about teaching, but that we don't have a frame for the whole of what we know, that we don't have a map," end quote. So why do we need a map, and what issues do you think perpetuate in education if we don't have that map?
Thank you for that question, Tom. It's a good one. The reason I wrote the book, the reason I think we need a map in education is we know what's involved in teaching. We know there's entire fields of study, and we're getting really deep into the weeds in really everything there is to know about teaching. That's educational research, and it's very valuable to us. Mm-hmm. But we don't have a unified theory or map or visual of the whole of teaching. Right. I think that's problematic, specifically because teaching, the act and the process of teaching. I want to be clear that I'm not talking about the whole job. I'm just talking about the act and process of teaching itself. So car duty is not part of what we're talking about, but you will definitely do that if you're a teacher. Right. So this thing is so complex that if we don't have a shared vision, a shared picture of what this is, it allows us to continue adding on to that complexity. Mm-hmm. So for people who are educational decision makers, administrators, lawmakers, whoever they may be, they know a lot, or for administrators, probably all of what teaching is. But if you don't hold that complexity in your head as you're making decisions, it's easy to add to the complexity.
Right.
And that to me is an excellent reason to say we need a common picture. We need a map of this thing, so that we can use it as a lens through which to make decisions. Mm-hmm. I think it does have utility in other ways, for pre-service teachers, for beginning teachers, in the same way that a map for travel is useful to you. All the roads are on the map, but you're only on one road at a time when you're traveling. But when you're on that road, you need the context of the whole thing. Yeah. So less of a way to hold people accountable or beat them up that they haven't mastered the whole, seeing the whole while you are focusing on developing your skill in a particular area is valuable. Right. So I think it's important. An analogy that's in the book that I've used before is, it's like teaching's this forest, and we're really good at examining leaves and branches, but we're so focused on them that we've forgotten the expanse of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And that perspective, I think, is important to the current health of the profession, which I contend, along with many others, is very much under threat, very much, I believe, in doubt. Right. So that's why I think we need a map.
me pick up on that, because something I mentioned that you have said, and I mentioned this in the introduction, and when you said holding people accountable and beating people up, often I'm assuming you're referring to like standardized testing data and things like that. Can you expand on this idea of what you mean when you say the deprofessionalization
Yeah.
of teaching?
Yeah.
What I think I know what you're getting at, but just for our listening audience, let's talk about
Sure.
what is the context for that? What do you mean by that?
So first of all, I would point your listeners to folks who have been doing this a lot longer than me, who have studied this work, including Linda Darling Hammond, including the folks who have studied what works, what systems of education that are successful around the world look like. Richard Ingersoll is a researcher who has laid out the definition of a profession and cross-referenced that with teaching, and says teaching meets all of the criteria of a profession, but some of the markers of a profession uh, uh, are being stripped away from teachers, such as autonomy, social standing, and compensations in the mix there as well. And the problem isn't that teaching is complex. The problem is the contrast between the complexity and those benefits that other professions enjoy that are either denied teachers or are under granted to teachers. So the deprofessionalization looks like a continuous adding to the responsibilities. And some of this is in the book, but you've got to think about all of the things that teachers have to do that really don't have anything to do with teaching.
Right.
They're wonderful things to do, but in other countries, schools don't attend to the mental health of students because someone else is doing it. Schools don't need to attend to, or even to a large degree, the health of children because someone else is doing it. But every educator is a mandatory reporter, as well they should be. But if you see as more and more responsibilities pile on, individually, they're perfectly reasonable. But when taken together and then held in contrast to the rights and privileges that other professions and professionals enjoy, that's what is significantly contributing to this erosion of the professionalization of teaching. And so it becomes no wonder that it is difficult to retain accomplished educators in the profession and to recruit young people to the profession.
Is it just in your, from your perspective, in your opinion, is this just a particular perspective that people, the general public, has about education, about teaching? It seems that whenever something ails society, it's we need to teach that in school.
Right.
In the school seems to always be the answer.
Right.
And yet simultaneously, or almost, there's this dichotomy of we need the schools to do more, and yet we don't trust you and we deprofessionalize you. From your perspective, is that where that's coming from?
My perspective is that that is a significant contributor to it, but I
Okay.
can't hang the entire thing on that source.
Right.
We have a profession that's set up to move in this direction. I think it'd be very unwise to miss the original design of public education, at least in the United States, that it has always been majority female. You can't overlook that the beginning assumption was we can pay less, we can have this status. So when you begin to add on the historical design of the profession with this increasing expectation, you arrive where we are today.
Yeah, there's roughly, I think it's in both Canada and the United States, I think roughly 75% of all educators are women, and I don't think you can overlook that at all. I think you're spot on with that. And speaking of sort of society, of course, in our current context of the pandemic, and of course we're in various stages of the pandemic still, we have seen a sharp uptick in our focus on relationships and developing, SEL competencies in our learners. teachers often assert, especially I see this on social media, that it's all about relationships, that students have to Maslow before they can bloom. And look, I don't want to downplay the importance of relationships, far from it. And I know you yourself talk a lot about how important it is to know your students. However, you also contend that content knowledge matters, which I think gets downplayed in a lot of different circles. So again, from your perspective, why does subject expertise, content knowledge matter?
It seems overly simple.
Right.
I would contend that you can't teach something you don't know. That's not what teaching is.
Mhm.
That you can possibly supervise someone while they learn a thing that you don't know,
Mhm.
but I cannot cause you to learn a thing I don't know. Now, I perhaps could push you to a level of competence beyond my own, but subject area expertise does matter.
Right.
That's the nature of teaching. So, uh, to your illustration, I think those claims are fair enough in the context of systems of accountability and responsibility that imply that only outcomes matter.
Mhm.
Um, when is a school held accountable for relationships? When do we say, you know what, the school is going above and beyond in producing strong relationships and social, emotional, etc. No, we use that as uh, okay, but when we label a school failing, we would say, oh, but
Mhm.
they do produce good relationships, instead of saying, here's a school that is, we have documented, is outstanding in building relationships. It's not an equal playing field. So I'm arguing on in defense of the teachers who say, and perhaps they literally are saying it's all about relationships, but I think the real message is relationships matter just as much
Mhm.
as the setting out of knowledge for students to pick up.
Right.
um, and um, the students are, we know for sure that students are less likely to learn a lot or to learn deeply from someone with whom they have no positive relationship, or indeed a negative relationship.
Right.
But you there are all kinds of examples of relationships in the world around us that are very positive, that do not include effective teaching.
Right.
So it's essentially inseparable. And if we're discussing any kind of mental pendulum swing to, if we can just do relationships, well, that's the whole battle. No, of course not. That's not right at all. Indeed, that's the argument of the book, is that teaching
Right.
is so very complex that if you remove, and the quotes from some of the teachers that participated in the original study, if you remove any part of teaching, by definition, that's not teaching anymore.
Right.
That's an attempt at teaching.
Right.
Yeah. Knowledge matter, subject matter, absolutely is important to this process.
Yeah, it's my revision to the assertion of Maslow before they can bloom is to Maslow through bloom, that you
Nice.
build relationships through that learning experience. Because as you contend, and we all kind of know, of course, is that learning is at the center of the experience, and so we can build relationships on the periphery, which is important in the early stages to get to know learners, as you say, get to know your students. But I think ultimately the students find out what matters to us, what we prioritize, and how important their learning is at the center of the experience. And I think that's something that we all have to kind of keep in mind as we think about the importance of subject knowledge. And I'm going to maybe put words in your mouth, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you talk about subject expertise or content knowledge, you're not just talking about sort of content memorization, but you would also be contending that you have to know something about critical thinking. You'd have to know something about 21st century learning, collaboration, et cetera, so that you can
Right.
teach it. That's a fair assumption on our part, on your
Yeah.
position? Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that does bleed over into
Hmm.
pedagogical expertise, for example.
Right.
And even in the book, when I say 13 competencies and practices, it would be a mistake to think that you can draw bright lines between many of
Right.
them.
Right.
When you talk about instruction,
Hmm.
where's the line between student engagement and
Hmm.
implementing an activity, for example. So when you pull the thing apart to examine it, you have to understand that it's not, it's not as if it's modular and put together. It's ways of understanding this very complex thing. So yes, absolutely. Content knowledge is, if I'm a mathematics instructor, I have to understand the mathematics. I also have to understand the ways in which students make sense of mathematical thinking, and then so it begins to blend together with what that means. I think what we're saying is, not any warm body will do. Teaching is a very demanding, a very specialized profession, and so it matters that you know the thing that you're trying to convey to students.
And yet we know in so many school districts that this really puts some teachers in a tough position because, as they're fulfilling contracts and they're teaching subjects that might be outside of their area of expertise to fulfill the terms of their contract, it puts some teachers in a position where they're teaching subjects that they might not be as familiar with. And so school districts and principals really doing what they can to ensure that people are at least in the vicinity of their expertise. So there's maybe an acceleration of that knowledge. Now, we know that content knowledge in its broadest sense, if that was all we needed, then of course, university professors would probably be the most effective teachers on the planet, but they are often not. And I don't mean any disrespect by this, but for example, some of the worst teachers I've ever had in my entire life were my professors in my undergraduate program. Now, simultaneously, these same people were some of the most brilliant people I've ever been around. I could listen to them for hours, theorize about different ideas. I was a history major, so talking about history, I could listen to them for hours. But actual teaching, not so much. So what does the research tell us? You mentioned this just a moment ago. What does the research tell us about the importance of developing our pedagogical expertise? What's the research say on that?
First of all, I want to creep out there on that limb with you and not call any specific people out, but say my experience, in fact, was in a couple of cases, individuals who you should assume had the best grasp of the way teaching works in their own practice did not exhibit this, were unable to provide, to model. I remember my undergraduate, there was a moment where I'm pretty sure the professor realized they were doing the exact thing they were telling us was poor practice and to avoid doing, and just kind of paused for a moment and kind of had an aha moment and then played it off and moved on. Your question, though, the research is pretty clear that interacting with young people in a room isn't the whole of teaching. That the things you do matter, and the way you do those things matter, and there's no lack of opportunities for teachers to hone their skill in teaching, in instructional practices, in pedagogy. And so pedagogy is more than just instructional strategies or approaches. It's also having a grasp of, I mentioned earlier, knowing the way in which students understand a subject, anticipating perfectly predictable misconceptions about a topic or a skill that students are supposed to learn. And the skill is understanding students. I'll give you an example. I'm very passionate about the middle level. So middle level educators need to have at least a basic understanding of young adolescents and how the science of the change that occurs in young adolescents and brain research at that age, how that impacts and how that interplays with learning at that age. In that specific setting, there are a lot of stereotypes that are placed on middle level, on middle school and middle schoolers, and those stereotypes are based on observations that ascribe meaning incorrectly. So the observations are not wrong. Yes, they're loud. Yes, they're impulsive, etc. But it lacks an understanding, and it jumps to a conclusion that says basically the job of a middle school is to keep the kids from killing each other so they can keep learning in high school. Instead of saying this is what we know about
Right.
how the brain works at this age. So now we know our students in that way. Now
Mhm.
we know the individual students in the group. And now we have a knowledge of the content that we've just talked about, which brings us to, therefore, what modes of learning are most likely to bring the students from where they are and what they know about the subject to where the learning target is.
Mhm.
So that whole synthesizing of these different types of understanding that we have into a plan for what to do, that's a deep understanding of pedagogy, and it's not singular at all.
Yeah.
So you can talk about lots of different approaches to teaching and learning.
Mhm.
And I think the pitfall is when someone tries to imply that any one of them is, the silver bullet or the magic,
Right.
instead of saying how do I have this range of tools, instructional tools, and I'm really, really skillful at matching the content and the learner, the set of learners I have, and the goal, and producing learning that actually advances students' knowledge and attainment closer to the learning target.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned middle level. I share your passion for middle level. I spent about half my career in terms of my time in the school system working with middle level students in middle schools. Recently I've had some interesting experiences with middle school teachers in professional learning situations because I've made mention that middle schools aren't random, that middle schools are schools that were developed to address the particular stage of development of young adolescents between the ages of 11 and 14. And it somewhat surprises me, and this is not their fault because they're newer to the profession. It's the collective fault that they don't know that some of the
Correct.
teachers I've worked with are kind of like they never thought of it that way before.
Correct.
I think their perspective was middle schools were just meant to break up the flow, the flow of they're a little too old for elementary and a
Right.
little too young for a high school, but they didn't really know why. That's not the majority, don't get me wrong,
Sure.
but it's been interesting to
Mhm.
hear teachers react to that assertion that these schools are built for that stage of development and not knowing that. So somewhere along the way, that message has been lost. And I suppose as we go on in decades away from the genesis of middle schools,
Mhm.
we start to see that message kind of gets diluted, and people don't realize that's the focus.
Right.
Um, you write on page 69 of the book. I'm going to quote you here. It's a bit of a long quote, but I really love this. So you write on page 69 that all students learn more deeply when they engage in authentic experiences. Teachers should design and provide these experiences for all students, including those who receive special education services and who are behind in terms of grade level learning goals, instead of only to students classified as gifted or accelerated in their learning, end quote. So the question that I have to you that often comes to mind when you say we've got to engage students in these authentic learning experiences, and I think this is a particularly important question for somewhat novice teachers.
Sure.
And the question is how?
Mhm.
How do you create these authentic experiences for such a wide range of learners in a classroom?
Absolutely. So one thing to start with is in education, we're really good at um, beating ourselves up for not doing all of the things. Like we have to hit every target and every standard and substandard and all of those things. So this we've talked about the importance of understanding the content area. Content area standards are a very healthy way of saying this is the educational attainment that we're aiming for.
Mhm.
Uh, but for teachers, understanding that and then tagging in the discussion we've had about pedagogy, what's the best, the approach that has the best chance of moving students in that direction, planning multiple opportunities for students to learn can be done in the context of understanding your students well. If you
Mhm.
have a good understanding, and I'm not talking about having 120 middle school students and having 120 different plans, but what we're talking about is Are you keeping track of your observations of how students and groups of students within your charge tend to thrive, tend to learn better? And how can you provide these opportunities to students? And some of this can be at the micro level. So I had this experience just a few months ago. I can't even remember the exact context, but somehow I've just finished a graduate program, so maybe it was in one of those classes. But the purpose of algebra came up, and I had never heard that. And I'm near the end of a graduate degree, and my reaction was actually anger. And I said, I never have thought that I'm good at math. I've always disliked math. And my reaction in the moment was, why could this have not been explained to me and taught to me when I was supposed to be learning algebra way back when I was a teenager? Instead, I was taught how to solve problems,
Right.
to solve equations.
Mhm.
And so for me, at the micro level, providing authenticity in the learning at the micro level, the reason why we're doing X is explained to students. And then you can also provide authenticity in the macro level, things like project-based learning, problem-based learning. So these really
Right.
large enterprises that bring meaning to students. But I want to come to this point. This is not to put pressure on teachers. This is to
Right.
say the learning has to have meaning. And
Mhm.
sure, your state, your district, whoever said so, therefore it must be. But
Mhm.
from a philosophical point, what's the point of pursuing learning that doesn't have meaning?
Right.
So make sure that your students understand why. The best question a student can ask you is why. Why
Mhm.
are we learning this? So
Right.
don't be irritated by that. Preemptively explain and help them understand. And trust me, kids, you'll need this in 10 years. Is not acceptable to
Right.
to a
Right.
student, right? Like that or because I said so. So that to me, so authenticity can look a lot of different ways, but it doesn't have to mean planning huge projects and a different project for every different kid. It can
Right.
be a living practice in what you do to say, my students have to see my discipline as something that's alive, not a thing that's sitting there and holds still for you to learn and then you're done with. If you're teaching science, I mean, the field of science is alive and moving around, right?
Mhm.
So how can we get in there and have scientific thinking? And then you could talk about other subject areas as well, like
Right.
help kids make meaning of what they're learning. That will spark. I mean, I wanted to say every student, but that is really powerful. That's going to bring a lot of your students into the process of learning with you.
Okay, and let me shoot a question at you here because I think this is a question I get frequently.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious as to what your response would be. I get the question, so I'll phrase it to you, Andrew. Listen, it's unrealistic, especially at the younger grade levels, where students are forced against their will into the subjects they take. They don't have a lot of choice in middle
Sure.
level. They don't have a lot of choice. You get into the upper grades of high school, they have more choice.
Right.
So we're putting students into all of these subjects. It's unrealistic to think that students are going to have an authentic passion or keen interest in every single subject that they have. So if a
Yeah.
student says to you, look, I'm not that interested in science, or I'm not that interested in English language arts, or I don't really enjoy mathematics, what's the answer to the question of how do we connect them in terms of relevance? I get that question a lot. Curious as to what your
Yeah.
answer would be. How do we help learning become relevant for those students who don't really have a passion for the subject that they're in?
I love it. Let's tie back to a discussion we just have. As a teacher, uh, how deep is your content knowledge in that area? Um, with no blame to anyone,
Mhm.
we can see the putting across of a subject in a way that's not true to the living. Look, you name a subject. There's some awesomeness about that. How can you bring the wonder of the thing to the student? Um, Example: I work with our school libraries here, and we're trying to really do good work around building cultures of reading, engagement in reading. Something I heard, I'm pretty sure I stole it from someone, but something I say all the time is there's no such thing as a reluctant reader. There are only readers who just aren't interested in the books we've put in front of them. We haven't figured out yet what they're passionate about. So if the learning becomes a search for passion, science is huge. Maybe you just don't like the science we've done so far. Math is amazing. I love geometry. I did not like the other ones. I did not like, now I know it's that whole algebraic field, and I'm salty that I wasn't made passionate about it.
Yeah.
So this to me is part of being a teacher, is also opening the eyes of students to the wonder of what they're seeing. That knowledge and the application of knowledge is an incredible thing. It is so powerful to do. And have we empowered students to take it where it might lead them? And the goal is not to produce mathematicians or readers or yes, readers, not maybe writers and award-winning producers of content, but it is equipping and setting on a path that says, perhaps this is for you. And how can you engage with this? That's just a rambling answer. Oh, how helpful that is to the elementary teacher who has a kid that has decided they just won't, they don't want anything to do with writing.
Right.
But I'm firmly convinced that if you persist and help a child find their passion, that's the key. And here's the thing: be like Edison. If you don't find the kid's passion, but you help them be sure of the things they can cross off the list, the next person might help them find the thing. So persist and continue to help the kids say, well, then let's try another thing. And don't take it personally that they don't love the thing that is in your part of the process.
Yeah. Reminds me, when I answer that question for people, I often remind them of what Steve Jobs used to always say, that the consumers don't know what they want until we show it to them. And to pick up on that parallel, I think you're spot on with the idea that it's possible that many students aren't passionate about science because we haven't shown them enough about what science is and its breadth. And so ask them, talk to them, find out what they're curious about, and reveal to them what science or math or English language arts or whatever the subject is. Reveal to them the full depth and breadth of what you can, and you'll undoubtedly find something that they're curious about. I want to finish up, Andrew, today with assessment and grading. As you know, Andrew, is very near and dear to my heart. I know it is for you as well. And I think that's probably how we became connected years ago, was our shared passion for assessment and especially grading. I know it's a passion for you. You say in the book that evaluation is an important part of all of the processes intended to make, produce, or nurture something. And you go on to say, and I absolutely love this, unless any outcome will do, it is essential to keep track of where the current performance is in relation to the goal. The entire academic purpose of teaching is to advance all students to learning goals. Monitor the state of progress toward those goals is an integral part of teaching itself, end quote. One of the irritants I find right now for me currently is the dismissiveness and, quite honestly, the wrongheadedness and the performative way that summative assessment, many educators talk about summative assessment, and listeners, you've heard me rant about this many times in the past. So I'm curious from your perspective, Andrew. I think this is one of those questions where I think I know how you're going to answer, but hoping you can articulate this for our listeners. What for you would be the ideal balanced assessment system in a classroom?
All right, so forgive me, it's a horrifying sports analogy, but today especially, but for the longest time, effective coaches use information to make decisions. I'm avoiding using the word data because in education, when we say that, we mean standardized test scores.
Mhm.
But coaches use information, and before there was technology to assist this, coaches would remember a tendency of a player or something they have noticed and patterns. And that's what we're talking about. That's what we should be talking about in a class. So my ideal balance, or the ideal system here, looks like from the beginning we're very clear about what the learning target is and what attaining it might look like. So this is how we'll know it when we see it. And then we have to say, where are we starting from? Student by student, and students need to be involved in that process. Come back to the sporting thing. A basketball player knows they've missed a free throw. They're not going to argue that, no, I didn't, right? So where is my proficiency in the goal? And then as we do the things we need to do to gain competence in the knowledge or the skill that we're pursuing, along the way we notice progress. So I like the word, and I've been recently using the word noticing. We need to notice what's happening, because that implies that the purpose of doing that is to ensure that we're on track. There's nothing punitive about that. It's knowing that we're still on the trajectory and we're progressing towards where we need to go. We also need to give a nod to the importance of understanding that learning needs to be the constant, not time. Because we say on this day, students knew or did not know, have progressed or haven't progressed, instead of saying, this is the learning attainment, are you moving towards that? As opposed to, who has hit this and now let's do another thing. So to me, a continuous commitment, a practice where uh, individual students' progression towards the learning goal is noticed by the student and the teacher, and decisions about what to do next are based on those things. And then, of course, at the end, we record how that went, and it's a record. And sure, on this day, this is the level of attainment. So I'm not saying you should be able to go back to your first grade records and correct them when you're in sixth grade, or change them. You preserve the record, but even then, it should be less about judgment and more about observation. As of today, this is where the student stands in relationship to a learning goal.
Yeah. It reminds me of something I say often in workshops and conferences, et cetera, is that what we report about student learning should be, and it's just a bit of a play on words, but it should be the cumulative impact of instruction and learning, not what the student has accumulated over time. That in this moment we accurately report. And your thoughts about time, and learning, one being the constant, one will vary. It's an interesting dichotomy that often emerges in education, where we know that some students need longer to learn, not just take longer to learn, but actually need longer to learn. And yet in so many of our systems, and this is obviously improved by comparison decades ago, but this idea that some students need longer to learn, and yet you are disadvantaged in your grade book or on the report card if you don't learn fast enough. And
Right.
so it's an interesting dynamic that emerges. Andrew, I know I could talk to you about assessment. We could do a whole a whole episode
Absolutely.
on assessment. Maybe we'll do that down the road. 2 questions left for you, Andrew, as we finish up today. And these are questions that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction that you'd like. But educationally speaking, the question is, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah. So literally keeping me up at night is, Tom, I've got to be honest here, and I'm gonna be a little dark. I believe that public education is in a lot of trouble. I believe, in fact, I say to my close colleagues that I hope very much to be wrong, but I think that a crash is inevitable at this point. what that looks like is not exactly clear to me. But consider, for example, something you mentioned earlier, our inability to find qualified people to hold teaching positions.
Right.
I'm hearing stories of schools this year who are flipping to virtual settings, not because of health concerns, but because they can't find enough adults to safely supervise the kids. We're not just talking about teachers, we're talking about substitutes and other positions. Imagine a school where, and with great respect to organizations like Teach for America, imagine entire school of teachers who don't intend to stay in the profession.
Mm-hmm.
We hear stories of students who go years without ever having a certified math teacher, and they're progressing from grade to grade and have never, from 7th grade through 11th grade, never once had a certified teacher.
Right.
That's why I wrote the book, is for us to say we have to address the state of public education. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think the issue that's at the heart of all of it is the adults. Tom, grading doesn't matter if there are no adults here. If we don't have accomplished teachers to dig into their practice and grow their practice, it doesn't matter.
No.
I work on summer learning here, and we do a lot of great work with that. It doesn't matter if we don't have people to do it. And so the question is, how can we get really, really serious about us as a profession? I think that so recruit and retain is on everyone's lips right now. And I've got a hard word for the profession. I think that it looks to me like a lot of our recruit and retain discussions and enterprises are about finding the right shade of lipstick. I'd like for us to figure out how to stop being a pig. When can we wake up to that? So for me, part of that and the heart of that is, how do you professionalize teaching? Because the evidence from other countries is that if you professionalize teaching, all of the other outcomes that we're seeking from education are possible. Professional educators can produce what we want from public education. I'm oversimplifying, but I think that. So what keeps me up at night is that this profession will break before I can retire. And I really hope I'm wrong. And I'm fighting day and night to make my own fear not come true.
Right.
But I apologize to your listeners. That's very bleak, but that's what keeps me up at night, is the fear that my grandchildren, and my oldest is just a freshman in high school, so many years from now,
right,
my grandchildren may not reasonably be able to get a good education from a public school.
Yeah. The goal here is not to gloss over things. And yes, it's Happy New Year, but we also have to stay focused on things that are important. I don't think your fears are unfounded. We all collectively hope you are wrong. But at the same time, I think you are taking, an honest look at the profession. So last question for you, Andrew. It's a question about success.
Yeah.
It's a question, again, I ask everybody, and it's a simple question that says, if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success, how would you answer them?
I believe that every person is designed through your upbringing, your life experiences. You're designed for a thing, to accomplish a thing. And just like, this is an analogy, not saying one is the other, in the same way that you can use a tool to do a thing that it's not designed for, but it works best when it's doing the thing it's designed for. To me, success is finding out what you were designed to do and then throwing yourself into that. And your best is good enough, and less than your best is not okay. You owe your best to the rest of the humans, and you do not need to feel guilty or feel bad about any kind of there's no relative thing here. It's about you, what you were designed to do. Are you doing that thing, and are you doing your best at it? If your answer to that is yes, that's success.
I love that. I love that idea of finding out what you're good at and your contribution to the rest of society, and what your contribution is to that. I absolutely love that. Listeners, you know that normally as we finish up an interview, I usually give out the guest's Twitter handle, but something interesting I know about Andrew that I think you'll find interesting as well is that Andrew actually grew up in Nigeria, and your Twitter handle is interesting as well, Andrew. So I'm going to let you quickly tell listeners the story behind your Twitter handle, and maybe just a little bit about your background and how your Twitter handle came to be.
Sure. Yeah. So I did grow up in Nigeria. My Twitter handle is Ezigbo _. Let me spell it. EZIGBO _.
Yeah.
I grew up in Nigeria, and I'm going to say spoke. I don't have enough practice to say I'm still fluent in Igbo, one of the main languages of Nigeria. But Ezigbo basically means like truth, or it could mean one who is true, like both. So there's this honesty feel about it, but it's also about like your metal, like being someone who is reliable, I would say. So I seek to be someone who doesn't shy away from being honest, but telling the truth in ways that are productive, not using the truth to hurt others.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I love that in your background, and certainly as someone who's been to Nigeria, I just really appreciate culturally the country, and I can only imagine your experience growing up there. What that must mean to you. It's clearly impactful still to this day, for sure, and shapes who you are and the thoughtfulness with which you approach the profession. Listeners, you can also find Andrew on LinkedIn as well. So we'll have links to the Twitter handle as well as Andrew's LinkedIn page. We'll put those in the show notes. Hey, Andrew, listen, it was great catching up with you today. Thanks for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
Tom, thank you so much for the invitation. It was my pleasure.